Actually, the silence has always seemed artificial to me, but I don't know when the 15 seconds is over, but hopefully it'll be over soon. And it's not like we're meeting the Queen in any case, so we're not going to be rude if we speak earlier. Okay, I'm hopeful that it is live streaming now. So let me welcome everybody. Salam, namaste, good evening, good morning, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to the second season of the Summer of ISHQ. I'm Madhavi Menon from Ashoka University, and we're here to talk about all the things that have fallen by the wayside, mostly in the recent past, prime among which is ISHQ, but also attendant upon which are ideas of debate and discussion and dissent, all of which have been devalued systematically, especially in some parts of the world more than in others. So welcome to Summer of ISHQ. I am joined today in our second panel of this webinar, joined today by two wonderful, fabulous thinkers and speakers who are going to talk about the question, what is queer performance? And our first speaker for today will be Anne Pellegrini, who is Professor of Performance Studies and Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU, New York University. And our second speaker for today is going to be Sandra Chatterjee, who is co-founder of the Post Natyam Collective, which is a transnational alliance of dance artists. And let me just quickly go through the format for all of you who haven't attended before, and then I'm going to hand it over to Anne and Sandra. Each of them is going to begin with a 10-minute cogitation, meditation, theorization of the question, what is queer performance? And after which I will just throw out a couple of questions based on their opening remarks for them to have a conversation with each other. And after those 10 minutes are over, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience for the next 25 minutes or so. Which reminds me, please, audience members, post your questions in the Q&A box at any point in the first 30 or 40 minutes of our session. I don't think you can post it in the chat box because that's been disabled for you, but in the Q&A box, and Neil, who will join us at the halfway mark, is going to curate your questions and present them to Sandra and Anne. So without further ado, let us begin, and let me invite Anne to share with us her first 10 minutes on the question, what is queer performance? Anne.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning, this afternoon, this evening, across all time zones, I think, as befits the issue of, let's say, queer temporality. But I think that would actually be another seminar than today's topic, which is on what is queer performance. And it seems to me that this question, what is queer performance, involves some other questions having to do with the who of performance, right? The what of performance and the how and what then of performance. So one of the things I'm interested in sort of briefly exploring is this tension, right, between the who, is the queer in queer performance descriptive of the identity of the one performing? So this tension between the who of performance, the what of performance, where maybe we could think of the stylistics or the form that performance takes. And then finally, the how or the what then of performance, namely the unpredictable constitutive effects of performance on performer and audience. And here, the related question is, what does performance do, right? Both to the performer and to those witness to the performance, those caught up in, let's say, the contagion of queer performance. And one of the things that certainly people who've been thinking about queer performance and practitioners of it have been thinking a lot about is the contagiousness of what it can do, what it can beget, not fully intentionally, but what performance can do to the audience. Maybe another way to put all my questions, and I'm going to come out with lots of questions here, queries. We want to think about, is the queer in queer performance a noun, an adjective, a verb? And if it is a verb, is it a transitive verb or an intransitive verb? And I guess I want to say yes to all of the above. This is a way, I suppose, not just of having my cake and eating it too, but of having the entire cake and eating it too. And so I hope to serve up some possibilities for you. I'm not myself in a position to offer a genealogy of queer performance. For those interested in genealogy, that critical genealogy of queer performance, I would especially recommend a new book by Amelia Jones. And that title is in between subjects. It's a critical genealogy of queer performance, which came out this year. But there's a prompt that Jones offers in that book. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. Remember, I talked about this tension between the who of performance, the what of performance, and the how or what then of performance. And one of the things Jones points out to us is that we might want to keep in mind this important tension between, let's say, and she talks about this with regard to Sylvester's queer anthem, "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real." And one of the things she points out is the necessity to kind of to walk a critical line. Maybe it's a paradox. It's to walk a critical line between the urgency, the felt urgency, the political urgency of declaring oneself as queer, like positing queerness as an authenticity, as an identity, and certainly in liberal rights regimes, it has seemed to be necessary to sort of posit oneself as an identity, even if that positing, the claim of I am, fill in the blank, is understood by the one making that claim, I am, fill in the blank, to be a kind of conjecture or an hypothesis, a strategic necessity, right? But Jones says we have to sort of walk that line between the critical political urgency of declaring queerness as identity, an authentic identity, and an openness to the reverberating, vibrating effects of queer as it veers off course and creates new possibilities that are irreducible to identity claims themselves, all right? So that's also something I've been deeply interested in my work. Again, what can queer do to those who are experiencing it? Now, there's a tendency, and I speak as someone based in performance studies as one of my fields, to think about queer performance as always progressive, as sort of like it's for the political left or has effects that are politically progressive. And I want to pull back on some of that insistence. Because another one of my fields is actually religious studies. And I've been really interested in my ongoing work in the ways in which religious communities, and this is not new, right? But religious communities also believe in the power of performance to change us in our substance, to queer the one performing and to queer the ones who are being the audience of the performance, right? But this notion that sort of performance can do something to us and queer us in the sense of spoiling us, right? This is a long history. In the Western thought, we can go back to Plato's Hysteria in the Republic about mimesis, the idea that the mimetic arts of poetry and theater can actually sort of alter our being on the right course to wisdom and truth, right? So that's Plato. Then we can think in Christian theology, Tertullian, who likens the theatricality or theater to idolatry. Jump forward to the Puritan era in England. We have Philip Stubbs with his 1583 treatise on the anatomy of abuses. Jump to the British colonies and the early blasphemy law, which becomes the basis of obscenity statutes in the United States. Early blasphemy law specifically proscribes any filthy, obscene, or profane song, pamphlet, libel, or mock sermon in imitation or mimicking of religious services. I'm quoting from the Massachusetts Bay Colony statute. So here, this early blasphemy law in the United States links theatricality with anti-religiosity, right? So we could even think of this as a kind of queer performance avant la lettre. I've been interested in my recent work in writing and thinking about how some religious communities in the United States, evangelical communities that are hostile to homosexuality and transgender, how they're using theater as a way to sort of convert, to reach especially youth audiences, to convert them into the right course in relation to, sort of Christ our Lord. So these are Christian missionizing performances, but I want to claim them as queer because they believe in the power of performance to sort of, again, reach in and change audiences in their substance. And this, I think, has a kind of discomforting then relationship to the queer and queer performance that those of us on the left, and I certainly think of myself as being on the politically left, that some of the same claims are being made by proponents of a kind of homophobic Christian theatricality for the power of theater to reach in and change us in our substance, as are being made by scholars of queer performance and by many queer performance practitioners themselves, that queer performance can change the audience and change the performer too. So how do we think about this overlap, right? That isn't about political ideology, nor does it obey divisions, problematic divisions, to be sure, between the religious and the secular, right? So there's a sense in which queer performance queers those binary distinctions as well. And here I'm reminded of something that the late Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick wrote in the journal GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies. So that journal, which has been around, I think, since 1993, one of the founding journals, certainly English language journals in queer theory, what would come to be called queer theory. And the very first issue of that journal, so the issue 1, number 1 in 1993, Sedgwick wrote this famous essay about queer performativity, focusing on Henry James's The Art of the Novel. And early on in that essay, Sedgwick's already sort of looking at the kind of exhaustion of some of the ways in which we think about subversive performance and make subversive claims for queer performance and queer performativity. And she says, and I'll quote her here, so I don't botch the quote. She says, she's actually talking about, we reached the point in our analysis and we're like, wait a minute, this could go either way. Basically, she says, the bottom line is generally the same, kind of subversive, kind of hegemonic, right? And this could lead to a kind of exhaustion, exasperation. And how do we talk about queer performance if, in fact, as politics could go in so many different directions? But that multiplicity, right, that sort of pushes even against our beloved binaries of the good, the true, the politically correct, that multiplicity that presses up against political binaries and the binaries of identity, the binaries of gender, the binaries of sexuality, of race, of national belonging, of religious belonging. I think this is also part of the energy of queer that we want to hold on to. The queer is troublesome. It certainly has political effects, but what those effects are, we cannot know in advance. And it also spoils things for better and for worse. But I'm still going to stick with my cake and hope it's sweet to the taste. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne, for those fabulous, rich, caramelly, maybe even chocolatey opening remarks that were certainly sweet and lovely. And let me invite Sandra now to make her opening remarks, and then this is already auguring well for a wonderful conversation between the two of you. Sandra, please.
Thank you so much again for the invitation. And also I'm really excited to follow these opening remarks, because I think there's many thoughts that you mentioned that I can sort of resonate with. I'll be talking kind of from the two hats that I wear a lot. One is a performer and choreographer, and one is an academic. So my thoughts are going back and forth from speaking as a practitioner and speaking as somebody who might stop and reflect and think about things. And what I did in preparation for this, in this vein, is I sort of looked at my trajectory of looking at queer performance since about 2003 or 4. And I realized it always went back and forth to exactly something that Anne much more eloquently put as like somewhere hovering between looking at identity and looking at something as a verb, as a process, as a queering. So a lot of it stems from the tension of encountering queer theory and queer performance while studying in the US and living in the US, but being trained in classical Indian dance. And it seemed like the performance or the tendency or the trajectory or the impulse to perform autobiographically was always at a certain tension with the training, for example, in Abhinaya. Which, at least in the way I've learned and understood it, and here I'm not talking about as a scholar of the Natya Shastra, but as a trained classical dancer, was about transcending the idea of identity or identifying with what you're supposed to perform on some level. So kind of bridging those two points of interest and two impulses led to this tension of going back and forth between autobiography and queering as a process, or what does that mean for queer performance or queering performance. One of the articles which I wrote with one of my co-members of the Postnatyam collective, Cynthia Lee, actually looked exactly at that tension, and it looked at the possibility of solidarity in relation to, for example, the idea of a rasika, of somebody who watches with an open heart and is able to receive the intention of the performance. So we were tackling exactly this. What are this tension? What are the impulses of performing autobiography? What are the tenets of going beyond autobiography? And what, in both ways, are the potentials for solidarity in a different way? Like in one of them, is it inviting the audience to identify as somebody who shares this identity? Like, what does it do to the audience, as you had put it in your impulse? Or is it about opening up a space for an audience to go along with an open heart on a journey, which they may or may not identify with? And what does both of them mean for the potential of solidarity? This is one of the issues that came up. Another one, again, in the work with the Postnatyam Collective, I'm just giving some highlights of this, sort of revisiting my engagement right now. Again, worked in this tension between Abhinaya and thinking about queer performance and queering. And it's again an article and as well as a piece that is a solo by Cynthia Lingley, but directed by Shamla Murthy, and I'm the dramaturg, so it's a Postnatyam collaboration. And it's an article, again, co-written by Cynthia and me. And we were looking at, for example, what are these implications or what are the assumptions in terms of associating a dance technique with the identity of a performer? For example, what are the underlying assumptions between performing a classical Indian dance form, but not necessarily being Indian by identity? And what are the expectations and failures in terms of achieving that performance of Indianness in that? And how can we look at the concept of queering performance as a way of dislodging this sort of almost biologized connection between technique and the performer and their identity? So we looked at the concept of, first, it moved in this process from looking at, okay, somehow this feels culturally queer. But then we transformed from this sort of adjective to looking at queering cultural belonging through performance. And in that process, always the question is, what is the underlying connection between queering and Abhinaya? In more recent work, and I'm always getting to how interestingly identity always does creep back in. So since I'm half Indian and half German, something that always rings in the back of my mind is also the vernacular etymology of the word queer when I think of queer. And without, I mean, even though I know Eve Sedgwick also wrote about this etymological connection, but for me, it's a very vernacular connection that is like, whenever I hear queer, it's also queer. And queer is just something that is oblique to the norm, oblique to also the dominant, the hegemonic. So from that perspective, queering Abhinaya became, or looking at queering and Abhinaya became a way of like, how can we think of this obliqueness also in the way in which we do processes, in which we do performances? How, for example, is it if we apply the technique of Abhinaya to something that has nothing to do with an Indian context in terms of content? So things like that ushered in from these larger things, and kind of by just keeping reminding myself of the etymology of queer, it took it away immediately from the identity question as a first impulse. In the most recent iteration of thinking about queering, there were two moments. One, again, was with the Postnatyam Collective when we looked at a dancer called Maud Allen, a Canadian dancer of the early 20th century. And what's interesting in this later work is that the issue of ancestors keep coming up in different way. And in some way, Maud Allen could be looked at as a queer performance ancestor, because it's relatively well documented that her longest term relationship was with her female secretary, even though she publicly did not identify as lesbian. In fact, when she was called that, reacted rather harshly against it. And at the same time, there's a sense of disappointment with her in the sense of denying her lover on one level, but also in the sense of the Orientalism and exoticism she performed. So then it became about, yes, what is this tension between discovering a potentially queer performance ancestor, but being really disappointed by her and how to perform that disappointment. That brings me to another ancestor, and this is my last thought, and I'm sorry I'm giving like a whole range of thoughts. In the current research project I'm working on, we are looking with a team at the University of Salzburg. It's a funded research project from the Austrian Science Fund, but we're looking at a dancer called Nyota Inyoka, who was a Parisian dancer, who was half French and half we don't know exactly. She's most likely maybe half Indian. And she did Indian, quote unquote, she called herself a choreograph undo. But she's an almost forgotten dancer. We don't know anything about her much. And she's maximum in the like passing mentions in dance history books or in footnotes. And we are kind of working her archive and trying to, and my part is a lot of practice as research where I'm trying to embody based on notations and images what we have in the archive, who she was and what her dance might have looked like. And here I was starting to look at remembering as queering ethnicity based on what Fatima El Tayeb said about how, European others who've been in Europe for a long time, but who are not non-white Europeans, in certain activities like remembering and like creating a history for themselves in Europe, are queering like whiteness of European ethnicity.
Okay, thanks so much, Sandra, for that rich arc and archive that you presented to us. I mean, this is fascinating to listen to the two of you together, and there's just so much I want to ask about. But let me just pick up first on that extremely resonant term that Anne used, resonant, of course, because we're all living in this particular moment of contagion. And you're both actually talking about contagion. And I want you to think about it, please, if you will, in relation to this question of representation, which is so vexed etymologically, of course. I'd be happy to hear you both talking about the word about, representation, what that does to the idea of a true self, a real self, an authentic identity, and the sort of presentation of it or performance of it. But I'm thinking about that with the increasing number of calls we see around us today for that kind of authenticated representation. So more and more we're seeing in film industries across the world, or dance performances across the world, or stage traditions around the world, this idea that a role has to be played by someone who ontologically or experientially fits that role. And, Sandra, this very much goes to what you were talking about. Now, is that, I'd like to hear what you think about that demand, but my added question really was, is that demand really a fear of contagion? Is there something in that demand that asks us to refrain from contact with the outside, whatever that might be, or with otherness? And what might we gain or lose from that fear of contagion in relation to representation? So I'd love to hear both your thoughts about this. Anne, would you like to go first? Or yeah, please.
Sure. This is such a fascinating question, and I'm thinking about, one of the things that's importantly happening, right, is that it's long been a practice, and I'm thinking, let's say, the portrayal of, I'll use identity categories, the portrayal of gay and lesbian characters, let's say in mainstream cinema and television in the United States, that there's long been a tendency to cast either self-declared straight actors or actors declared to be straight in such roles. Now they're actors presumed to be straight because that's the presumption, right? And here, this unmarked category, the norm, these straight actors are also presumed to have the capacity, because they represent the human, they stand in for the universal, they can therefore tap into the experiences of others because they're not so trapped by identity. So those actors get the chance to sort of stretch themselves and pretend to be people that no one could mistake them to actually be, right? So they get the grace to actually act. And acting that is a certain kind of opening to other possibilities, other, sort of, let's say, characters, other forms of becoming. Whereas the actor known to be gay or lesbian, and for a long time it hasn't been safe in terms of the security of one's professional life to be an out gay or lesbian actor who wants a mainstream film and TV roles, right? The actor known to be gay or lesbian is thought to be trapped in that identity such that no audience would believe that person could be something other than, quote, gay or lesbian. Moreover, I think it even is assumed that actor themselves is so constrained by identity, they have no imagination of the universal because they're too particular, right? So this is really interesting, because is the insistence, and I understand the insistence, the demand that, LGBTQ people be cast in as LGBTQ people and not just give these roles to straight people who already have more opportunities, is this to get trapped in the bind of identity in which sameness performs sameness, in which we presume to know the same? Does this make sense? That in asking for the possibilities for queer actors, are we still actually binding them to their identity and to the particular?
Right. Sandra?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this actually very well puts what I'm grappling with, and the question that I have about in this context, like what happens, like what is the balance and what is the line between asking for that equal opportunity on some level to perform everything, but how can it become a trap? And I just want to go back to a little bit to the training again, because it's interesting, because one of the trainings that we go through in classical Indian dance is Ekaharya Abhinaya, which means that you switch characters. You don't change costume, and within one narrative you switch characters. You don't change the way you look if you perform a male character or female character. And once that is an integral part of your training, I mean, so many of these things are dislodged, but it does not obviously address the discrimination based on saying, like, somebody who identifies openly cannot perform something else. So that is the conundrum. Yeah.
Right. And of course, what you just outlined, Sandra, is very much in stark contrast to at least what little I know of, broadly speaking, Western performance traditions, in which performers can be fairly rigidly trapped by racial identity markers, and, as Anne very cogently described it, sexual identity markers. So, so for instance, Orson Welles can play Othello painting his face black, but a black actor cannot play a white character. And that to me is always fascinating. In fact, the recent Hollywood rule that you have to have, what is it, 33% of minorities in your film production, to me the most interesting use of that would be in order to do this kind of movement. So not just sort of invent black characters, but allow blackness itself to actually travel and to traverse categories. And I'm not sure that has happened yet, but I really hope it does.
Right. I wonder if this links to something that Sandra was talking about, which I found really interesting, which has to do with what can be felt to be the limits of a kind of, I think you experienced this in your training in the States, Sandra, the idea of a kind of the autobiographical performance. And I wonder if we could separate an autobiographical performance from a confessional performance, that an autobiography that isn't presumed to speak authentically about itself as truth, right? So we get to have autobiography to see and hear different diversities without assuming they tell us the truth about race or sex or gender or religion, for example.
Yeah. That's interesting. An autobiography that lies. I like it. And it's a new genre, a new category altogether. No, that's wonderful. And I would love to have this conversation further with you, and maybe I'll butt into the audience questions. But unfortunately for me, we are at the point where Neil is going to come on and start asking you some of the questions that the audience has for us. But really, the sort of rich stew of what happens when the left and the right start mirroring each other in their investment in performance. What happens when representation and presentation both have to do this dance around the idea of contagion? I mean, both of you have opened the field up so much for us that this is very, very exciting. So thank you for that. Neil, all yours now with questions, please.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such a rich conversation. It prompts us to think deeply and more vividly about, the styles, the formats, the frameworks, the material and the bodies, that mark queer performances on stage as well as in the quotidian. So here's a question. Um, when does queerness come to performance? Is performance always already queer, or does the performance bring queerness to performance? Sorry, does the performer bring queerness to performance? Anybody can take it up. Or if you want me to repeat, I can also do that.
I think the question was clear. So, I mean, you can jump in whenever, Sandra and Anne, and in whatever order, please.
All right, I'll have a go. I think that's a fantastic question. And again, I'm sorry, I seem like a broken record. I shall again have my cake and eat it too. Like it's both, right? Because there's a certain way in which performance maybe has something in it that is always at least has the potential towards queerness. If we think about the performance, that even a performance which is a devised performance, there's an author, there's a director, there are choreographers, the actors are given roles, or the dancers are given movements. So it's really it's tightly scripted in some way. Even that will have effects on the performers and on the audience that cannot be scripted and controlled in advance. So that's partly what I mean by saying there's this queer potentiality. It can do things in excess of the will to know and control its meaning. So we can think of queerness in that sense. But I also want to hold on to something of the specificity of queer performance, with queer as an adjective that is also connected to issues of sexuality, or maybe in a psychoanalytic vein, the sexual, which also has to do with an excess, things that can't be fully known, but which then maybe draw on cultural repertoires, including cultural repertoires of gender and sexuality, to sort of code themselves. But I think we want to have it both ways. There's an inherent queerness, a queer potentiality in performance, but there's something about queer plus performance that can do something different.
I mean, I just want to jump in before Sandra does and just say, absolutely, Anne, if you look, as you suggested, we do, at the history of violence against performance, it's always rooted through the idea of the sexual, always rooted through the idea of sexual contagion, sexual corruption, sexual loss, lack, all those things, that all attacks on, to this day, continuing to this day, on performance tend to be rooted, I think, through that. So, which very nicely, as you said, hangs on to a certain libidinal particularity of queerness, while also opening it up to a certain kind of theoretical insistence on what Sandra would call, running oblique or aslant of the normative. Sorry, Sandra, please. Sorry, Anne?
I was going to say one more thing. I think this is so important, the way you just focused on the attacks of performance always have an attack on the libidinal currents of performance. Yeah. But those libidinal currents, and this is also maybe something of the property of the libidinal, it attaches to other cultural identity markers. So I'm thinking about in the history of the United States, the anxiety in the late 50s after the court rules in Brown v. Board of Education for the desegregation of public schools, forces who were in favor of segregation, I'm thinking in Arkansas in particular, among the anxieties they had about what would happen if you desegregate schools is that Black and white children will be in dramatic productions together. They'll be in theaters together, playing love scenes, and something will catch. So there's a bringing together of the libidinal current. Performance will do something to these Black and white children. They'll come to like, if not love each other. to have a
Right.
fear of racial and sexual contagion at once via performance. It's astonishing, but amazingly on point for what you just said about the libidinal currents.
Right, absolutely. Wow. Sandra?
That's a fascinating example, really. Yes, how yeah, really the potentiality in performance, which we sometimes maybe forget a little bit. In terms of, I would second the both, um, but also at the same time the call for a nuanced uh, looking at each situation, at each encounter, at each performance, at each performer, and maybe I can just enrich that agreement by with a little example of the current sort of historical research that I'm engaged with, which I'm not a historian at all, and this is the first time I'm venturing into this new territory. But it's incredibly anxiety provoking to propose things which I have no clue whether this choreographer would have agreed to or not. Right? And so when I talk about this whole aspect of queering ethnicity, or through performance, of queering practices through performance, when I have no idea really what her standpoint on these things would have been, it asks for like really careful dissecting and thinking at each step. Is that me queering? Is that me seeing a queer potential in something that may or may not have been there for her? Is that a queer potential that would have been there in the 1920s, or do I see that in 2020? And so these kinds of nuances, like it's like it never, each step, there's and I think it's not just with historical research. I'm learning this in this particular context, but I think it really applies to everything on some level. So I think I would like to add that. Yes, both, but really nuanced at every step.
As scholars of literature, we often think dismissively that the authors are the least interesting people on their own work. So we don't actually pay much attention to them. And so I recommend that attitude highly to you in relation to choreographers or artists from the past as well. Neil.
Yeah, so this question ties in some sense what Anne was talking about. Could you talk more about the potential of queer performance to hollow out the self-importance or the seriousness of existing structures, whether it be gender or some other form of social propriety?
So if I, excuse me, if I understand the question, so the idea of, because I sort of talked about kind of subversive, kind of hegemonic. So this would be the wish for a performance that's more subversive, or something that could open things up.
I mean, the potential to hollow out the seriousness of existing structures.
Okay. I think, okay, it's an important question, right? I guess one thing I would say is that we might not know, we might never know until in advance, right? Maybe we probably never get to know in advance what a performance is going to do, what its effects will be, what its short-term and longer-term effects will be. So it's after the fact we come to discover its effects, including for us, we who have performed it, right? So an example would be, and maybe since I suppose I was invited to someone who's performance theory and queer theory, is that so many of some of the foundational work in queer theories of gender and sexuality, and I'm thinking of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble from 1990, for example, and we could come up with more such examples, but I'll use Butler because of her very important and quite influential theory of gender performativity. The kind of emergence and the ongoing proliferation of extraordinary new genders, right? And the claims to new gender identities, like my beloved late comrade Jose used to speak of, kids today, the ways in which kids today are hacking gender, right? And it's brilliant and challenging and dizzying, including challenging and dizzying to the gender categories of generations, of queer generations before them, right? We could see this as in some way a kind of legacy of some feminist and queer theories that were themselves deconstructing gender. And so there's a taking up of some of these theoretical works and pushing them in directions that the authors of these studies were not anticipating, right? And couldn't control, like this ongoing signification, ongoing remaking of genders and sexualities and identities. So that, I mean, I want to think about the performance actually of queer and feminist theories. Like these are not static things, books and articles people read and do, and that's it. People do things with these readings, and these readings have done things to us, and they continue to do things with us. So that would be an example, right? And certainly now there are global attacks going on against transgender transgender people globally, right? At different kinds of transgender, understanding this as I'll use that as an umbrella category. And there's an anxiety about sort of the pressure these new genders, some of which aren't new, they're just being newly seen, are putting on binary systems. And here we could see that, so something that is challenging, let's say subversive, although people doing this aren't doing this to be subversive, but doing this to survive and flourish. If it has subversive effects, fantastic. I don't know that this is the primary reason someone is doing this, right? But the attacks on it also show that there will continue to be adjustments, right? The politics will shapeshift in the face of the confrontations, the new opposition to these brilliant new genders that are making themselves known and declaring themselves and claiming public space.
Sandra, would you like to jump in and add that? I mean, I'm also reminded, and in relation to this, I mean, you of course alluded to Sedgwick's, wonderful, so intuitive, such an intuitive maxim. You cannot tell in advance what anything will do or what anyone will do. But also just to honor, our colleague who passed away recently, Lauren Berlant, this idea of performance being crucial or affect being crucial to understanding how societies actually work or how people actually work, because we actually don't work by rationality or logic alone or largely. And so that's what I think both of you are really getting at the sort of political importance of thinking about performance, because it drives politics as we know it today, even as it becomes one of the fields that politics will most vociferously diss or discard, because it doesn't want itself to be tainted, going back to that idea of contagion. It doesn't want itself to be tainted by it. So I'm really fascinated, and by what you just said about this idea of going places where you don't know you're going, but not naming those places necessarily as performance or performative. And I find that tension, to go back to Sandra's word, also very interesting to think about. But Neil.
Right. Thank you so much. Next question is, what is campy about queerness, or queer about a camp performance? Anybody can do it.
Sandra, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I'm reminded, or I'm in my mind, I'm going back to Anne's opening remarks, actually, where you highlighted the who, but also the how, and obviously camp in a sense as a very specific form that has developed to me. I mean, that's how I haven't studied camp as such, but I'm like talking maybe about as a performer who's watching performance colleagues, for example, and observing their means and their means of creating. And so I see it and thinking as somebody who thinks a lot about technique, to me, and I might be totally off the mark based on somebody who might have studied it actually and thought about it theoretically. But to me, it's really interesting to think of camp actually as a technique, the way I think in relation to queerness, the way I would think, for example, even about the technique that I'm trained in, classical Indian dance. And it might be a jarring juxtaposition, but in the end, if you look at them as technique and what they might be able to intend and what they might be able to achieve, that I think I find that very interesting. And with camp, I think what's very interesting is that the very close link of the sort of emergence of very explicitly or more directly queer performance, or what calls itself queer performance, and a very direct sort of like intervention that that is, you know, is inherent in that. So the link for me is very direct in camp, as a kind of how that is very closely linked to other aspects of queerness and performance, if I want to dissect them. So I don't know if that that makes
I
sense.
am totally fascinated by what you just suggested about camp as a technique, and maybe even, if I understood correctly, potentially a choreographic technique. Because one of the things I'm thinking about with camp, and you know, Sontag's famous, infamous notes on camp essay, you know, basically says camp puts everything into quotes. It's not a lamp, but a lamp, right? And the essay is infamous because, you know, she doesn't mention homosexuality until the very end, until like the third from last paragraph or something. But if I'm still thinking about a technique, and maybe you could talk about this, what would be like a dance technique that puts things into quotes? Like I heard, if I understood, I don't know classical Indian dance, but I heard that one of the things you do is you try to dislocate it from its culture, like its particular culture of performance and production, to connect it to like threads or themes that don't necessarily fit classical Indian dance. And that feels like a putting into quotes, if that makes sense, of what the classical Indian dance would be. And I wonder if, would that be like a camp technique that you're working with?
I mean, I think the way in which we have borrowed from camp, and why I think I'm also looking at it as a way of staging, as a way of bringing to performance, rather than just like purely a physical or dance technique, necessarily. But that is the way in which and I'm sure it's much more than that. But as a performer, that has been the primary way in which I've been inspired by it. And so, yes, I mean, I think there is a particular way of putting in quotes that I think I would resonate with in relation to camp, like in the sense of, you know, overly highlighting certain elements or putting them like changing proportions, I think, in a way, and changing relations of things, and yeah, also blowing out of proportion maybe. And I think those are definitely things that we have on occasion also in post-natyam sort of been inspired by and drawn on and intersected with Abhinaya and other techniques. I mean, we're not only trained. I mean, I highlighted Abhinaya here now because somehow it related a lot to my questions and tensions around queer performance, but we also do other kinds of, or draw on other kinds of techniques. So, yeah.
That's great. And that ties up also with what Anne was talking about earlier about queerness as an excess, or the something that's always an excess of requirements, surplus to requirements, which is exactly, you know, what you're both talking about so fabulously.
Thank you so much. That was just amazing. Okay, so next question is, if we look at queer as something against or out of hegemony, is it ever possible to queer as a verb, a state religion? Can religion be potentialized as a platform for queer performance?
Sandra, Anne, did you hear that properly, or would you like me to repeat? You're fine? Okay.
Okay, yes and yes, but again, the politics aren't guaranteed. You know, some of my research has been on evangelical hell houses. These are kind of Halloween amusements that are put on in the United States, primarily by a Pentecostal community, the Assemblies of God, and they occur throughout the United States. And these are, they riff on secular haunted houses, which are actually things that a community might put on, or actually there are paid haunted houses you go through and you're basically paying to be scared. Hell houses are performances that try to scare you to Jesus. So around Halloween, a church will put on, or maybe it's a church school, will put on a kind of a haunted pageant. And you're taken through, you're often taken, it's like you're taken through a space. It's a kind of immersive theatrical experience. You're taken through space. Maybe it's a room in which you witness a scene of a girl, like a young woman, a teenager who's pregnant and trying to decide whether or not to have an abortion. She has an abortion, and on her deathbed, because of course we know that she's going to die in this abortion, but on her deathbed, she's presented with the possibility, will she convert? Will she declare her faithfulness to Christ and therefore be saved? She gets to go to heaven, despite the fact of the grave sin of abortion, or will she stick with this decision and she goes to hell? So each of these theatrical vignettes has high stakes, right? Binary high stakes, heaven or hell. And they're organized around contemporary issues of which homosexuality and abortion are always two of the themes in these hell houses. This is queer theater because the belief is that these theatrical scenes can reach the audience, witness to them, reach in and change them. And I think that is that is a kind of queer, an intuition about the power of theatricality to mutate, shapeshift us, we who witness it. And that is not aligned with the politics that I think queer performance usually affiliates to, right? Politics of the left, politics of, quote, the secular, however troubled that category is. On the other hand, and here I'm thinking of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. This is a group of basically drag queens. Some of these participants would be trans women, but who dress up as Catholic nuns, and they actually do charitable works. They are a community, and there are chapters in the United States, throughout Latin America, and they also do protests of the conservative sexual politics of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church. So they dress up and drag as Catholic nuns, but it just can't be, but it's also morally serious, right? They actually see themselves as a political spiritual community. Melissa Wilcox, a scholar of religion, has written brilliantly about the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. That would be an example of queering religion, and for the left.
Right. Sandra?
I'm not sure how much I have to add, because maybe this is also an addition I've actually rather avoided thinking about this context of religion and the queer in the past, due to, I think, a lot of different conundrums this opens. So I don't know that I can address it very deeply, but what comes to mind is the fact that, again, I'm going back to the training and sort of like a kind of way of performing I'm used to and trained in, and that, so that's, well, like I mentioned before, a kind of performance of certain characters which are steeped in sort of non-secular contexts, and they have been more facilitators, really, to me, of thinking about queering and an opening possibility than shutting it down. And I think that's probably the only thing I can add to that.
That's great. Also, one thing to highlight, maybe because of some of us being situated in present day India, is the sort of almost quotidian nature of the performance of religion as performance. And we don't think about it as performance because it's not, it's not in a stage, in a hall that you go to see, but it is nonetheless being performed around us, going back to that entire sort of non-performative performance of politics, which is very much steeped in religion at the moment. And so deeply, deeply distressing, almost like a hell house. But the less said about that, the better now, I think. I think we have time maybe for one more question, right, Neil?
Yeah. So this question goes, and you spoke of multiplicity and potential of queer performativity in those contexts. And Sandra, you spoke about queering biologist connections to technique. So in that light, how do we think of racist performance techniques like brownface, blackface, and cultural appropriations? And it can also apply to South Asian context as well. Whoever wants to go first.
I'm fine either way. What comes first to my mind is the conundrum that Anne, you mentioned also about the sort of certain, like, on the conundrum between being assigned or fixed in certain roles of performance, versus claiming the openness or claiming also a kind of right to perform. And it seems to me that the conundrum involved in this question is related to what we discussed before. Because obviously, the sort of discomfort around creating these performances of fixed identities, I think very strongly resonates also with the racist practices, even though they're in a different way. And they are not affixed to the identity of the actual performer, but like it's fixed to the identity that is supposed to refer to or represent. But to me, it has a similar quality of fixity. And fixing within a dominant racist hegemonic pattern, which is exclusive. And so to me, the approach of queering again could, address, even though they are could address the sort of nuances of where they go against each other and where they might be drawing on similar discourses, but in very different ways. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think this dilemma of fixity you just raised, it goes back to something that Malavi you raised at the very beginning, which is this idea of this ontological match between the performer, and a presumed ontological match between the performer who's going to be cast in the role that he, she, or they is going to portray. And I find myself thinking, so how far is the ontology of this match supposed to go? Right. It's like, are you allowed to cast, let's say, an African-American actor with known conservative politics to play Malcolm X? Like, is the ontology only skin deep? Or does it go to this, like, somehow this characterological substance of the person playing the politics? Let's track how this person has voted for years, what manifestos they signed on to. I mean, so like, do we, in our desire to to rightly criticize racist performances, racist stereotypes, sexist, et cetera, do we then say that here's the only way you can portray these historically minoritized, peoples? So that we don't actually make room for the diversity, the often contentious diversity within our various communities, right? Because we know that the drawing of lines is not just between the hegemonic and the subversive, the in and the out. Those on the out also draw lines within our own, within our own communities. This is, a point famously made by Gail Rubin. Like, we each have our charm circle. We each, it's these exclusionary practices of representational politics. It's like baked in when we work through the train of identity. And we get, again, in the liberal regime, like with liberal regimes of law, it seems like we can only speak in the name of identity. And maybe we need to when we address the court. I'm thinking of the US court system, but we don't have to speak in the name of identity everywhere. And that's it's a mistake to think that we have to speak the same way before the courts, to a television audience, to a church, to our doctors, to our neighbors. Like, we get to code switch.
Exactly, and that sort of ties in with that question of identity becomes almost synonymous with consistency. And I don't see how anyone can assume that, because we're the most inconsistent species on the planet. But to say that one sounds and looks the same at all times is sort of odd. I know we're sort of almost out of time, but I just want to emphasize that last part of the question that Neil asked, which was about cultural appropriation, Neil, and what the two of you might think about that very quickly before we have to wrap up, alas.
I would love to hear Sandra speak to this, because you are appropriating Maud Allen, for example. Like, so the empire goes both ways.
Exactly. Like, in fact, that was a particular, that was like something we tried to explore as a possibility. What does it mean to counter appropriate? And how does that, what does that mean for performing disappointment, for example, as well. Cultural appropriation is a very it's interesting because that it raises, I mean, the can of worms is really open once you try to question sort of like the connection between a technique or a dance or a performance tradition and the identity of the person who does it. Like, what is the relationship, and when is something appropriation, and what does it take? Like, is identity again enough for it to not be appropriation, or does it take something else? Like, does it take a different kind of investment, commitment, or surrender, if you want to take it in more traditional terms, to something specific to not make it appropriation? And so what are the terms here? I think that's probably as much as I can add.
That's great. Anne, would you like to add something?
I'm just going to speak from a psychoanalytic language and just say, what if appropriation is another word for love? And what to do with the fact that those who appropriate do not necessarily understand themselves to be committing acts of injury. Right?
And
to think about the affect of appropriation.
Sorry, Anne, I love that, as it were. And just to extend it, what is there about appropriation that is not, that sort of flirts with the idea of the inappropriate, that, you know, that is not appropriate, and is the inappropriate another word for queerness? So we need to, I think, end on that note by thanking Anne and Sandra for a brilliant conversation. I really wish we could have many, many, many more hours with you. But before we end, I need to say that our next session of Summer of ISHQ will not be next Wednesday. We are inappropriately taking a break, but we'll be back on Wednesday, the 14th of July at 7 p.m. to talk about technology, which I think actually would be a good conversational partner for performance. But thank you so much, Anne Pellegrini, Sandra Chatterjee, Neil, of course, as always, and to all our audience members. Thank you for joining us. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.